Welcome to the Sleep Story Haven, your peaceful sanctuary where the whispers of ancient forests meet the gentle rhythm of moonlit shores. Here, time slows to the rhythm of your breathing. Worries dissolve like mist, and your mind finds the peace it's been seeking. Each story is crafted to guide you through enchanted landscapes and tranquil moments, designed to quiet your thoughts and prepare your spirit for deep, restorative sleep. So find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let tonight's gentle tale carry you to the peaceful dreams that await. Welcome to your Sleep Story Haven. Take a deep breath and let our story begin. The Garden of Gentle Laughter. A sleep story in 10 chapters and an epilogue. Chapter 1: The Weary Wanderer. Maya had been walking for what felt like hours through the misty twilight, her shoulders heavy with the weight of countless worries that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The world behind her had grown too loud, too sharp, too demanding, a place where every moment required her attention. Every sound pierced through her consciousness like needles of urgency. She moved slowly now, deliberately, each step a conscious choice to leave that frantic energy further and further behind. The path beneath her feet was soft with moss and fallen leaves, cushioning her steps in a way that made her movements feel dreamlike and unhurried. She couldn't quite remember when she had started walking, or exactly where this gentle trail had appeared, but it felt right to be here, in this in-between space where the air itself seemed to whisper of rest and quiet wonder. The last traces of daylight painted the sky in watercolor washes of lavender and pearl, colors so gentle they seemed to emanate their own peaceful glow. As Maya rounded a bend in the path, the trees began to thin, their branches opening like welcoming arms to reveal something extraordinary ahead. Through the delicate veil of evening mist, she glimpsed what appeared to be an enormous garden. Not the formal, structured kind with rigid rows and careful pruning, but something wilder and more mysterious. This was a place where nature seemed to have collaborated with some benevolent magic to create spaces of perfect tranquility. The garden stretched beyond what her eyes could fully comprehend, rolling in gentle waves of green meadows, dotted with clusters of ancient trees, whose trunks were wide enough to house entire families of woodland creatures. Streams wound through the landscape like silver ribbons, their soft murmuring creating a constant, soothing backdrop that seemed to slow her heartbeat just by listening. Here and there, she could see what looked like clearings where different kinds of light pooled, golden in some places, silver in others, with occasional patches that shimmered with the soft rainbow hues of soap bubbles or morning dew. But it was the sounds that truly captured her attention and made her pause at the garden's threshold. Beneath, the gentle whisper of wind through leaves and the melodic babbling of water over stone, there were other sounds that made her lips curve upward in the first genuine smile she could remember in weeks. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear what sounded unmistakably like laughter, but not human laughter. This was lighter, more musical, punctuated by splashes and squeaks, and gentle chirping that spoke of joy so pure and uncomplicated that it made her chest feel suddenly lighter. Maya stood at the garden's edge, feeling an invisible weight beginning to lift from her shoulders. The air here carried scents that spoke directly to some ancient part of her soul. The green sweetness of grass after rain, the warm vanilla of sun-heated tree bark, the clean coolness of moving water, and underneath it all, something that could only be described as the scent of contentment itself. It was as if happiness had a fragrance, and it drifted through this place like the most subtle of perfumes. She noticed that her breathing had naturally begun to slow and deepen without any conscious effort on her part. The tight knot that had taken up residence between her shoulder blades for months was beginning to unwind, muscle by muscle, as if the very air of this place contained some healing property that worked on contact. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists during her long walk, slowly opened, fingers relaxing as they hung loosely at her sides. From somewhere deeper in the garden came a sound that made her pause and tilt her head to listen more carefully. It was a rhythmic slapping noise, followed by what could only be described as delighted squeaking. The sounds repeated in a pattern that suggested play rather than distress, and Maya found herself taking her first step into the garden proper, drawn by curiosity and by something deeper, a recognition that this place held exactly what her weary spirit had been seeking without knowing it. The grass beneath her feet was impossibly soft, like stepping on the finest carpet woven from cloud and morning dew. Each step sent tiny ripples of comfort up through her legs, as if the earth itself was offering to support her in ways she had forgotten were possible. The path that materialized before her seemed to glow with its own gentle luminescence, not bright enough to be startling, but just sufficient to guide her way through the gathering dusk. As she walked deeper into the garden, Maya noticed that the sounds of that distant play were growing closer, and with them came other sounds: the gentle splash of water, the rustle of leaves, and what sounded remarkably like creatures having conversations in languages made of squeaks and chirps and gentle rumbling. She realized that she was approaching some kind of gathering place, a natural amphitheater where the garden's inhabitants came together for. What? She couldn't quite imagine, but every fiber of her being hummed with anticipation. The path curved gently to the left, following the natural contours of a small hill covered in what appeared to be the softest moss she had ever seen. The moss glowed with a faint phosphorescence that reminded her of moonlight reflected on still water, creating an atmosphere of magic so gentle it felt like being wrapped in a lullaby. As she crested the hill, the source of the mysterious sounds finally came into view, and Maya stopped walking altogether, her hand rising to cover her mouth as laughter, the first real laughter she had experienced in longer than she could remember, bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest. Below her, in a natural clearing surrounded by ancient willows, whose branches swept the ground like protective curtains, was a sight that defied every expectation she might have had about what she would find in this mysterious garden. There, in the center of a crystal-clear pond, fed by a small waterfall that caught the last light of day and threw it back in prismatic sparkles, was a group of dolphins. But these were not ordinary dolphins engaging in ordinary dolphin behavior. These were dolphins who had discovered the art of play in its purest, most absurd form. Maya settled herself on a moss-covered boulder that seemed perfectly positioned for observation, feeling her entire body sink into a state of relaxation she had forgotten was possible. As she watched, her eyes growing heavy with the peaceful contentment that comes from witnessing pure joy, the dolphins continued their elaborate game with what appeared to be a small, round pufferfish that bobbed between them like the most cooperative ball in the history of sports. The rhythmic slapping sounds she had heard were the gentle pats the dolphins gave the pufferfish with their fins and noses, keeping it airborne in a dance that was part water ballet, part comedy routine. The pufferfish, rather than appearing distressed, seemed to be enjoying itself immensely. Its little body puffed up like a spiky balloon, riding the air currents created by the dolphins' playful movements with what could only be described as dignified pleasure. Maya watched as one particularly acrobatic dolphin executed a perfect spin, catching the pufferfish on its nose and balancing it there for a moment before gently launching it toward a companion. The receiving dolphin performed an elaborate bow, as if acknowledging the skill required for such a delicate pass, before sending the pufferfish on to the next player with a movement so graceful it belonged in a dance performance. The sound of her own laughter surprised Maya, not just because it had been so long since she had laughed, but because of the quality of it. This wasn't the sharp, sometimes bitter laughter that stress and exhaustion had taught her to produce. This was something softer, warmer, bubbling up from a place in her chest that she had thought was permanently closed. It felt like rediscovering a room in her own house that she had somehow forgotten existed. A room filled with sunlight and the promise of rest. As the dolphins continued their gentle game, Maya felt her eyelids growing deliciously heavy. The combination of their playful sounds, the soft gurgling of the waterfall, and the warm security of her moss-cushioned seat was creating a cocoon of peace around her. She let her eyes drift closed for just a moment, telling herself she would just rest them briefly before continuing to watch the enchanting scene before her. In that moment between waking and sleeping, Maya heard something that made her smile, even with her eyes closed. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of what could only be penguin voices, not the harsh cries she might have expected, but something more melodious, as if an entire colony of penguins was engaged in the most civilized of conversations. The sound grew closer, mixing with the dolphins' gentle play and the ever-present whisper of water and wind to create a symphony of contentment that seemed to wrap around her like the softest blanket. When Maya opened her eyes again, the last light of day had faded into the gentle glow of what appeared to be bioluminescent flowers scattered throughout the garden like nature's own night lights. The dolphins were still playing, their game now accompanied by tiny sparkles in the water that lit up each movement like liquid starlight. But what captured her attention now was a new sound, the distinctive flapping and splashing that could only mean one thing: penguins were coming to join the party. Chapter 2: The Penguin Parliament. As Maya settled deeper into her moss-cushioned observation post, the sound of approaching penguins grew more distinct, accompanied by what she could swear was the rhythm of marching feet, not the harsh, military precision of soldiers on parade, but something far more endearing: the slightly offbeat, waddle-influenced march of creatures who took their ceremonial processions seriously, but couldn't quite overcome the natural comedy of their own bodies. Through the gentle curtain of willow branches that surrounded the pond came the most extraordinary procession Maya had ever witnessed. Leading the group was a penguin of remarkable dignity, standing taller than the others and wearing what appeared to be a small, glittering collar around his neck. Even in the soft, bioluminescent glow of the garden's evening light, the collar caught and reflected tiny sparkles that danced with each of the penguins' stately steps. Behind this distinguished leader followed a train of penguins in perfect formation, or as perfect as penguin formation could ever be. They moved with an air of such solemn importance that Maya had to press her hand to her mouth again to contain her delighted laughter. Each penguin seemed to be taking their role in this procession with the utmost seriousness, heads held high, flippers tucked neatly at their sides, though the natural sway of their movement created an effect that was more endearing than dignified. The lead penguin approached the edge of the pond, where the dolphins continued their gentle game with the pufferfish. And what happened next was so unexpected and charming that Maya felt her heart literally skip a beat with pure joy. The penguin stopped at the water's edge, drew himself up to his full height, and executed the most formal, elaborate bow Maya had ever seen. It was a bow that spoke of protocol and ceremony, of traditions honored and respect given where respect was due. One of the dolphins, seeming to understand the gravity of the moment, gently guided the pufferfish to a safe resting place on a lily pad before swimming close to the shore. What followed was clearly some form of interspecies diplomacy that operated on rules Maya couldn't even begin to fathom. But that somehow made perfect sense in this magical place. The penguin, whom Maya had begun thinking of as the ambassador, began what could only be described as a formal address to the dolphin delegation. His speech consisted entirely of varying tones of penguin calls, from deep, resonant sounds that clearly carried great weight and importance, to higher, more melodic notes that seemed to convey friendship and goodwill. Throughout his speech, the other penguins provided what appeared to be a chorus of agreement, nodding their heads in unison and adding their own voices at appropriate moments. The dolphins, for their part, listened with every appearance of rapt attention, their sleek heads bobbing occasionally in what seemed to be acknowledgement of particularly important points. When the ambassador's speech concluded with a series of especially dignified calls, the dolphins responded with their own vocalizations, clicks and whistles that somehow managed to convey both respect and warmth. Maya watched, fascinated, as this diplomatic exchange continued for several minutes. There seemed to be a genuine communication happening here, something that transcended species and operated on the pure level of play and mutual enjoyment. The formality of it all, contrasted with the inherent comedy of penguins attempting to be ceremonial, created a viewing experience that was both deeply relaxing and absolutely delightful. As the formal greetings concluded, the real purpose of the Penguin Parliament became clear. The ambassador waddled to a particular spot near the pond's edge, where a large, flat stone created what could only be described as a natural podium. With great ceremony, he climbed onto this stone and began what was obviously a very important announcement to the gathered assembly. The other penguins arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle around their leader, sitting back on their haunches in postures of attentive listening. The dolphins moved closer to shore, floating in a respectful formation that mirrored the penguins' arrangement. Even the pufferfish, from its lily pad perch, seemed to be paying attention to the proceedings. The ambassador's announcement was delivered with all the pomp and circumstance of a royal proclamation. His voice carried across the water with remarkable clarity, each call distinct and purposeful, though Maya couldn't understand the words, if indeed they were words in any conventional sense. The tone and cadence made it clear that something wonderful was being declared. There were moments of obvious importance that prompted enthusiastic responses from his audience, and moments of what seemed to be humor that sent ripples of what could only be described as penguin laughter through the assembled crowd. As the speech reached its climax, the ambassador raised one flipper high in the air and delivered what was clearly the central message of his address. The response from both penguins and dolphins was immediate and joyous. A chorus of calls and clicks that filled the evening air with sounds of celebration and anticipation. Maya found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in this magical scene. The stress and tension that had driven her to seek this place of refuge seemed like distant memories now, replaced by a warm, bubbling sense of wonder that filled her chest with lightness. She realized that her breathing had become so slow and regular that she felt almost like she was floating, supported by the gentle rhythm of her own peaceful inhalations and exhalations. What happened next exceeded even the charming absurdity of everything that had come before. The ambassador, his proclamation complete, waddled with great dignity to the edge of his stone podium and executed a perfect dive into the pond. But this was no ordinary penguin dive. This was a dive performed with the grace and precision of an Olympic athlete, creating barely a splash as he entered the water. The other penguins, following their leader's example, began diving into the pond one by one, each attempting to match their ambassador's elegant form. Some succeeded beautifully, slicing through the water with surprising grace. Others provided what could only be described as comic relief, hitting the water with tremendous splashes that sent waves across the pond and prompted good-natured clicks of amusement from the dolphins. Soon the pond was filled with both penguins and dolphins, all engaged in what appeared to be a swimming lesson of sorts. The dolphins, with infinite patience and obvious enjoyment, began demonstrating various swimming techniques to their new penguin friends. Maya watched as dolphin and penguin pairs formed naturally, with each dolphin taking responsibility for helping their partner improve their aquatic skills. The sight of penguins attempting to mimic dolphin swimming techniques was so endearing that Maya felt her heart might actually burst from the sweetness of it. The penguins, already excellent swimmers in their own right, seemed determined to master the more acrobatic maneuvers that came so naturally to their cetacean instructors. Watching a penguin attempt a dolphin's signature spin resulted in a movement that was part graceful aquatic ballet, part comedy routine, and entirely delightful. The ambassador, Maya noticed, had partnered with the largest of the dolphins, and their interactions had a quality of old friendship to them. They moved through the water together with an easy synchronization that spoke of many previous encounters. When the ambassador attempted a particularly challenging maneuver, something involving a backwards loop that seemed to defy penguin physics, his dolphin partner was right there to provide gentle assistance and enthusiastic encouragement. As Maya continued to watch this aquatic dance, she became aware that the sounds of the garden around her were creating a perfect symphony of relaxation. The gentle splashing of the swimming lesson mixed with the soft calls of encouragement from both species, the whisper of wind through the willows, and the constant, soothing murmur of the small waterfall. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear other sounds too, the gentle lowing of what might be cattle, the soft chittering of smaller creatures, and something that sounded remarkably like the contented purring of very large cats. The bioluminescent flowers scattered throughout the garden began to glow more brightly as full darkness settled around them, creating pools of soft light that reflected off the water and turned the entire scene into something from the most peaceful dream imaginable. The light seemed to pulse gently with its own rhythm, almost like a visual representation of deep, restful breathing. Maya felt her eyelids growing heavy again, weighted down by the profound contentment that seemed to emanate from every corner of this magical place. The swimming lesson continued in the pond before her, but the sounds were growing softer, more distant, as if they were gradually transitioning from a performance. She was watching to a lullaby designed specifically for her benefit. Through her drowsy contentment, she became aware of a new sound approaching, something that made her smile even as sleep beckoned. From deeper in the garden came the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, but not the sharp clatter of horses on hard ground. These were softer, more rhythmic, accompanied by gentle lowing sounds that spoke of creatures entirely at peace with their world. The sleepy part of her mind began to imagine what other gentle goofballs might be making their way toward this magical gathering place, and the anticipation of more wonder to come wrapped around her like the softest blanket as she let her eyes drift closed once more. Chapter 3: The Bovine Ballet. Maya drifted in that perfect space between sleep and waking, where the sounds of the garden seemed to weave themselves into her dreams, while still maintaining their distinct, delightful reality. The gentle splashing from the pond had settled into a rhythmic pattern, as the swimming lesson continued, punctuated by occasional calls of encouragement and what could only be penguin expressions of triumph when a particularly difficult maneuver was mastered. The approaching hoofbeats grew clearer now, accompanied by sounds that made Maya's sleeping mind smile with anticipation. There was a musical quality to the approaching procession, not just the rhythmic stepping of hooves, but something else, something that suggested bells or chimes moving in harmony with the footsteps. Underlying it all was a deep, contented rumbling that spoke of large creatures in a state of perfect happiness. As the sounds drew nearer to the pond clearing, Maya opened her eyes to witness what might have been the most enchanting sight yet in this garden of endless wonders. Through the gaps in the willow curtain came a parade of cows. But these were no ordinary farm animals going about their mundane business. These were cows who had clearly studied the art of movement and decided to elevate it to something approaching high art. Leading the procession was a magnificent Holstein whose black and white patches seemed to have been painted by an artist with an eye for perfect symmetry. Around her neck hung a garland of small silver bells that chimed softly with each step, creating a melody that harmonized beautifully with the garden's natural symphony. But it was the way she moved that truly captured Maya's attention and made her wonder if she was still dreaming. The lead cow was dancing, not the clumsy, stumbling one might expect from such a large animal, but actual, graceful dancing that incorporated the natural sway of bovine movement into something that was part waltz, part interpretive dance, and entirely mesmerizing. Her steps were measured and deliberate, each hoof placement creating a rhythm that the bells around her neck translated into melody. She held her head high with an air of dignity that somehow managed to be both regal and utterly endearing. Behind her followed a line of companions, each moving in the same measured, graceful pattern. They were cows of various breeds and colorings, some spotted, some solid brown or black. One magnificent creature with a coat that seemed to shimmer between gold and cream in the garden's bioluminescent glow. Each wore their own garland of bells, creating a harmony of chimes that layered over the lead cow's melody like a musical composition written specifically for this moment. As the bovine ballet approached the pond, Maya realized that this was no random wandering. The cows had come here with purpose, and that purpose became clear as they arranged themselves in a large circle around the water's edge. The swimming lesson paused as both penguins and dolphins turned their attention to the new arrivals, and Maya could see recognition and delight in their responses. This was clearly a regular gathering, a celebration that these creatures shared together in some form of interspecies harmony that defied every law of nature she thought she knew. The lead cow took her position at what appeared to be a designated spot near the willow trees, and with a grace that seemed impossible for her size, lowered herself into what could only be described as a curtsy. The bells around her neck chimed a perfect chord as she dipped her head, and the other cows followed suit in a wave of bovine courtesy that traveled around the entire circle. What followed was a performance that would have been at home in the finest ballet theaters in the world, if those theaters had been designed for an audience of delighted aquatic creatures and one enchanted human observer. The cows began to move in a pattern that was part dance, part ritual, and entirely magical. They stepped and swayed in perfect synchronization, their bells creating a rhythm that seemed to make the very air around them pulse with gentle music. Maya watched, completely mesmerized, as the dancing cows performed what appeared to be a story told entirely through movement. There were moments of playfulness where they tossed their heads and stepped with exaggerated lightness, as if pretending to be much smaller, more delicate creatures. There were moments of grandeur where they moved with the stately dignity of queens processing to coronation. And there were moments of pure comedy where they incorporated distinctly cow-like behaviors, a sudden desire to scratch an itch, the need to pause for a particularly satisfying chew, into their choreography with such perfect timing that it became part of the artistic expression rather than a distraction from it. The dolphins and penguins proved to be an enthusiastic audience, clicking and calling their appreciation at particularly impressive moments. Maya noticed that the ambassador penguin had taken a position of honor near the water's edge, his glittering collar catching the light as he nodded approval at various points in the performance. The dolphins swam in slow, graceful circles that seemed to mirror the cow's movements, creating a second layer of dance that played out on the water's surface. As the bovine ballet reached what appeared to be its crescendo, something wonderful happened that made Maya's heart swell with such pure joy she thought it might float right out of her chest. The lead cow, executing a particularly graceful turn that sent her bells singing, caught sight of the small pufferfish still resting on its lily pad. Without breaking the rhythm of her dance, she lowered her great head and breathed out the gentlest puff of air across the water. The pufferfish, responding to this attention with what could only be described as delight, inflated itself even more and began to bob and spin on the lily pad like a living balloon. The other cows, seeing their leader's innovation, began to incorporate gentle breathing into their dance, creating currents of air that made the bioluminescent flowers around the pond pulse and flicker in time with their movements. Maya found herself laughing again. That soft, bubbling laughter that seemed to come from a place inside her that had been locked away for far too long. The sight of enormous cows carefully coordinating their breathing to create the perfect atmospheric effects for a pufferfish's lily pad performance was so wonderfully absurd, and yet so filled with genuine care and attention that it seemed to sum up everything that was magical about this place. The performance reached its conclusion with all the cows returning to their original positions around the pond. As one, they lowered their heads in a final, graceful bow, their bells chiming in perfect harmony to create a chord that seemed to hang in the air long after the movement had ended. The applause from their aquatic audience was immediate and enthusiastic. A symphony of clicks, whistles, and penguin calls that spoke of appreciation and joy. But the evening's entertainment was far from over. As the echoes of applause faded, Maya became aware of new sounds approaching from yet another direction in the garden. These sounds were different from anything she had heard so far, a complex mixture of gentle whooshing noises, occasional soft trumpeting, and what sounded remarkably like the controlled breathing of creatures engaged in some form of meditation or focused exercise. The penguins and dolphins seemed to recognize these approaching sounds as well, and there was a quality of anticipation in their movements as they arranged themselves to welcome whatever was coming next. The cows, their performance complete, settled themselves into comfortable resting positions around the pond's edge, their bells chiming softly as they made themselves comfortable to watch whatever was about to unfold. Maya, feeling more relaxed than she had in months, adjusted her position on her moss-cushioned boulder and prepared to witness whatever new wonder was approaching. The sounds were growing closer now, and with them came the faint scent of something warm and earthy, tinged with the green smell of fresh vegetation, and something else, something that reminded her of circuses and peanuts and childhood wonder. Through the willow curtain came the shadows of large forms moving with surprising grace and deliberation. Maya could see the swaying motion of what might be trunks, the slow, measured placement of very large feet, and she realized with growing excitement that the garden's next group of visitors was going to be larger than anything she had seen so far. Elephants were coming to join the gathering, and from the sounds they were making, they were bringing their own form of entertainment to add to this magical night of interspecies wonder. As Maya settled back to watch whatever was about to unfold, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This place, these creatures, this entire impossible evening had given her something she hadn't even realized she was missing: the ability to simply watch, simply enjoy, simply be present in a moment of pure, uncomplicated wonder. The stress and urgency that had driven her to seek refuge seemed like echoes from another lifetime, replaced by this warm, floating sense of contentment that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The elephant's sounds were very close now, and Maya smiled in anticipation, ready to witness whatever gentle goofiness was about to be added to this perfect symphony of creature joy. Chapter 4: The Elephant Yoga Sanctuary. As the sounds of approaching elephants grew closer, Maya found herself entering an even deeper state of relaxation. There was something about the rhythm of their movement, slow, deliberate, and impossibly graceful for creatures of such immense size, that seemed to synchronize with her own breathing and heartbeat. The gentle whooshing sounds she had heard earlier now revealed themselves to be the soft whisper of air through elephant trunks, creating a natural rhythm that was part breathing exercise, part musical composition. The first elephant to emerge through the willow curtain was a matriarch of obvious wisdom and dignity. Her gray skin bearing the silver-etched patterns that spoke of many years of gentle living. But what made Maya's eyes widen with delighted surprise was not just the elephant's impressive presence, but the way she moved. This magnificent creature was practicing yoga, not the approximation of yoga that one might expect from such a large animal, but actual, recognizable poses executed with a grace and mindfulness that would have impressed any human practitioner. As Maya watched, transfixed, the matriarch lifted one massive front leg and extended it forward, while simultaneously raising her trunk high in the air, creating a perfect elephant version of warrior pose. She held the position with rock-steady balance, her breathing deep and regular, her small eyes half closed in an expression of serene concentration. Behind her came a procession of other elephants, each engaged in their own yogic practice. A younger elephant was performing what could only be described as elephant downward-facing dog. Her front legs stretched forward, and her massive rear end high in the air, trunk touching the ground in perfect alignment. Another had achieved an impressive side stretch, using a conveniently placed tree to support one side of her body, while extending the other in a graceful curve that would have made a professional dancer weep with envy. The assembled audience of penguins, dolphins, and cows watched this display with obvious appreciation and respect. Maya noticed that some of the penguins had begun attempting their own versions of the yoga poses, though the results were more endearing than technically proficient. The dolphins contributed by creating slow, meditative circles in the water that mirrored the elephant's mindful movements, while the cows shifted into more comfortable positions that seemed inspired by the elephant's obvious mastery of relaxation. The matriarch completed her warrior pose and moved seamlessly into what appeared to be tree pose, lifting one enormous foot and placing it against the inside of her standing leg. The fact that she could balance her considerable bulk on 3 legs while maintaining perfect stability was impressive enough. But the expression of peaceful concentration on her face transformed the physical achievement into something approaching the sacred. As Maya watched, completely absorbed in this display of mindful movement, she became aware that her own body was naturally beginning to mirror some of the elephant's poses. Without conscious thought, she found herself straightening her spine, deepening her breathing, and allowing her shoulders to settle into a more relaxed position. The elephant's calm energy seemed to be contagious, spreading through the gathered creatures and creating an atmosphere of profound peace that was almost tangible. The matriarch opened her eyes and looked directly at Maya. And in that moment of connection, something passed between them that transcended species and language. It was a recognition of shared experience, the need for peace, for rest, for moments of pure presence that existed outside the demands and stresses of daily life. The elephant's gaze was infinitely kind, filled with a wisdom that seemed to say, "Yes, this is exactly what you needed. Rest here. Breathe here. Be here." Slowly, gracefully, the matriarch began to lower herself to the ground, folding her massive legs beneath her with surprising delicacy. The other elephants followed suit, each settling into their own comfortable position around the pond's edge. But rather than ending their practice, this seemed to signal a transition into a different type of yoga, one that focused on breathing and meditation rather than physical poses. What followed was the most extraordinary guided breathing session Maya had ever experienced. The elephants began to breathe in unison, their trunks creating a soft, rhythmic whooshing sound that seemed to establish a perfect pace for relaxation. The sound was hypnotic, drawing Maya's own breathing into alignment with theirs, without any conscious effort on her part. As the breathing exercise continued, other magical things began to happen around the pond. The bioluminescent flowers throughout the garden began to pulse in time with the elephant's breathing, creating a visual representation of the meditation that painted the entire clearing in waves of soft, calming light. The water in the pond seemed to respond as well, its surface rippling gently with each exhale, as if the elephant's breath was moving the very elements around them. The penguins and dolphins, inspired by this display of mindful breathing, began to add their own voices to the meditation. The penguins' gentle calls blended harmoniously with the elephant's breathing rhythm, while the dolphins contributed soft clicks and whistles that seemed to carry the sound of the meditation across the water and into the deeper reaches of the garden. Maya found herself entering a state of relaxation so profound that she felt as if she was melting into the moss-covered boulder beneath her. Every muscle in her body seemed to be releasing tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Her breathing had synchronized completely with the elephants, and with each exhale, she felt layers of stress and worry dissolving away like morning mist touched by sunlight. The meditation deepened as the elephants began to incorporate gentle trunk movements into their breathing practice. They lifted their trunks slowly on each inhale, creating graceful arcs against the star-filled sky, then lowered them with equal deliberation on each exhale. The movement was so perfectly coordinated that it looked like a slow-motion dance choreographed by the universe itself. Somewhere in the middle of this profound meditation, Maya became aware of new sounds approaching from the distance, sounds that made her smile, even in her deeply relaxed state. There was a rhythmic clopping that spoke of hooves, but lighter than the cow's stately procession had been. Mixed with the hoofbeats came sounds of obvious joy, whinnying and nickering, that carried notes of excitement and playfulness. Even in her meditation-induced tranquility, Maya felt a flutter of anticipation. Horses were approaching, and from the sounds they were making, they were bringing their own brand of joyful energy to this magical gathering. She could hear splashing now too, as if some of the approaching horses were playing in water along their journey to the pond. The elephants seemed to sense the approach of new friends as well, though they maintained their meditative breathing with impressive focus. The matriarch opened one eye, and Maya could swear she saw the elephant smile, not just a lifting of the mouth, but a genuine expression of delighted anticipation that transformed her entire face. As the horse sounds grew closer, Maya noticed that there were voices mixed in with them, not human voices, but the kinds of sounds horses make when they're engaged in play or conversation with each other. There was clearly some kind of discussion happening among the approaching group, punctuated by what sounded like arguments over who got to go first at something, and who had gotten too muddy to be presentable for the gathering. The meditation session began to wind down naturally as the elephant's breathing gradually returned to normal rhythms. But rather than ending the peaceful atmosphere, this transition seemed to prepare the space for whatever new energy was about to arrive. The bioluminescent flowers settled into a steady, gentle glow. The water returned to its mirror-smooth surface, and the assembled creatures arranged themselves expectantly around the pond's edge. Maya felt renewed in a way that seemed to reach down to her very cells. The elephant meditation had done something profound to her nervous system. leaving her feeling simultaneously deeply relaxed and vibrantly alert. She was ready for whatever came next, open to whatever new wonder was about to emerge from the garden's magical depths. The horse sounds were very close now, and with them came the unmistakable sound of laughter, equine laughter that spoke of creatures so filled with joy that they couldn't contain it. Maya heard a tremendous splash followed by delighted whinnying. Then, what sounded like a very serious discussion about whether someone had gotten too enthusiastic too quickly. Through the willow curtain, she could see the shadows of multiple horses moving in what appeared to be formation, though a rather loose and playful formation. There were occasional breaks in the group as individuals got distracted by something interesting. Then the sound of gentle encouragement from their companions as they were coaxed back into line. Maya settled back against her moss cushion, feeling like a child about to witness the best circus act ever performed, and knowing with absolute certainty that whatever was about to unfold would be exactly what her soul needed to see. Chapter 5: The Aquatic Equestrians. The first horse to burst through the willow curtain did so with such enthusiasm that Maya couldn't help but laugh out loud at the pure joy of it. This was a paint horse whose brown and white patches seemed to have been applied by an artist with a sense of humor. And he was soaking wet from nose to tail, water streaming from his mane and creating small puddles with each step. But rather than appearing bedraggled, he looked absolutely delighted with his soggy state, prancing with the kind of pride usually reserved for horses who had just won major competitions. Behind him came a parade of equally wet and equally delighted horses, each one unique in both appearance and in their approach to being thoroughly soaked. There was a sleek bay mare who moved with such grace that the water streaming from her coat looked like liquid silk, catching the garden's bioluminescent glow. A stocky pinto gelding seemed to be deliberately shaking himself at regular intervals, sending sprays of droplets that caught the light like tiny fireworks. And bringing up the rear was a magnificent Clydesdale whose feathered hooves splashed with each step, creating a rhythm that was part percussion section, part dance number. What became immediately apparent was that these horses had not simply gotten wet by accident during their journey to the pond. This was clearly the result of some form of deliberate aquatic adventure, and from their expressions of pure satisfaction, it had been exactly the kind of adventure they had been hoping for. The paint horse who had led the procession approached the edge of the pond where the elephants were still seated in their post-meditation tranquility. With elaborate courtesy, he lowered his head in a bow that sent another shower of droplets cascading from his mane. The matriarch elephant, clearly delighted by this soggy visitor, reached out with her trunk and gently touched the horse's nose in what was obviously a greeting between old friends. What followed was a conversation conducted entirely in horse whickers and elephant rumbles. But the meaning was clear even to Maya's human understanding. The horse was telling a story, and it was obviously a very exciting story indeed. His eyes sparkled with mischief as he gestured with his head toward the direction from which he had come, occasionally pawing the ground for emphasis or tossing his mane in a way that sent more water flying. The other horses gathered around to add their own commentary to the tale, creating a chorus of equine voices that rose and fell with the rhythm of shared experience. Maya could pick out moments of obvious excitement, places where the story reached climactic peaks that prompted enthusiastic neighing from the audience. There were also moments of what appeared to be gentle disagreement about details, with different horses offering corrections or alternative versions of events. The assembled creatures around the pond listened to this equine storytelling with obvious fascination. The penguins had arranged themselves in attentive rows, their heads tilting back and forth as they followed the conversation. The dolphins floated close to shore, clicking occasional questions or comments that somehow fit perfectly into the linguistic flow. Even the cows had shifted to more alert positions, their bells chiming softly as they moved to get better views of the storytellers. As the story reached what appeared to be its conclusion, the paint horse gestured dramatically toward the pond itself, and Maya realized that whatever adventure they had just described was about to be demonstrated for the benefit of their audience. The horse backed up several steps, lowered his head, and with a look of intense concentration, broke into a gallop directly toward the water. What happened next was so unexpected and delightful that Maya found herself applauding along with the rest of the audience. The horse didn't simply splash into the pond like she had expected. Instead, he executed a perfect running dive that would have impressed Olympic swimmers, his body arcing gracefully through the air before entering the water with surprisingly little splash. The movement was so smooth and practiced that it was clear this was not the first time these horses had discovered the joys of swimming. The other horses, inspired by their leader's demonstration, began their own approaches to the pond. Each had developed their own signature style of water entry. The bay mare performed what could only be described as an equine ballet leap, all four hooves leaving the ground simultaneously as she sailed into the water with tremendous grace. The pinto gelding favored a more enthusiastic approach, belly flopping into the pond with such evident joy that the resulting splash soaked everyone within 20 feet and prompted delighted laughter from the audience, but it was the Clydesdale who provided the evening's most spectacular aquatic entrance. This magnificent horse backed up to what appeared to be a carefully calculated distance. Then began an approach that built from a walk to a trot to a canter to a full gallop. As he reached the pond's edge, he launched himself into the air with such power and grace that for a moment he seemed to be flying rather than jumping. His entry into the water created a splash so enormous that it temporarily obscured the entire pond from view. And when the water settled, every creature in the vicinity was thoroughly soaked and thoroughly delighted. Maya wiped water from her face, laughing so hard that she could barely catch her breath. The sight of dignified penguins dripping wet and still maintaining their formal postures, of elephants blinking water droplets from their eyes with expressions of amused tolerance, of dolphins leaping in apparent applause for the Clydesdale's spectacular entrance. It was all so wonderfully absurd and joyful that she felt her heart might burst from the sheer happiness of it. Once all the horses were in the water, it became clear that this was not simply a matter of cooling off or cleaning up. These horses had mastered the art of aquatic play in ways that defied everything Maya thought she knew about equine behavior. They had developed what could only be described as synchronized swimming routines, moving through the water with coordinated precision that would have made professional swimmers envious. The paint horse and the bay mare performed a duet that involved swimming in perfect parallel lines, their movements so synchronized that they seemed to be mirror images of each other. The pinto gelding had discovered that he could blow bubbles underwater and was engaged in creating elaborate patterns of bubbles that rose to the surface like liquid sculptures. And the Clydesdale, despite his size, moved through the water with such grace that he seemed to be floating rather than swimming. But the true magic happened when the horses began to interact with their aquatic audience. The dolphins, clearly experienced in interspecies swimming partnerships, began swimming alongside the horses, offering gentle guidance and encouragement. Maya watched in wonder as dolphin and horse pairs formed naturally, with each dolphin seeming to understand instinctively how to help their equine partner achieve maximum grace and enjoyment in the water. The penguins, not to be outdone, began diving into the pond to join the swimming party. Their natural aquatic abilities made them perfect companions for the horses, and soon Maya was witnessing the delightful sight of penguins and horses swimming together in formations that looked like the world's most charming water ballet. Even the elephants couldn't resist joining in the aquatic fun. The matriarch rose gracefully from her meditation position and waded into the pond, her massive bulk displacing water in gentle waves that the swimmers rode like natural amusement park attractions. She used her trunk like a snorkel, creating gentle fountains of water that the horses swam through with obvious delight. The cows, though less inclined towards swimming, contributed to the festivities by providing musical accompaniment. Their bells chimed in rhythm with the swimming movements, creating a soundtrack that transformed the entire pond into a natural concert venue. Some of the cows had positioned themselves at strategic points around the water's edge, adding their own gentle lowing to the symphony at moments that seemed to require vocal emphasis. Maya found herself completely absorbed in this aquatic spectacle, her body so relaxed that she felt like she was floating along with the swimmers. The combination of laughter, gentle music, and the peaceful sounds of water had created an atmosphere of such profound contentment that she could feel it seeping into her bones. Every breath seemed to carry away more of the tension and stress she had been holding, replacing it with this warm, floating sensation of pure joy. As the swimming party continued, Maya became aware of new sounds approaching from yet another direction in the garden. These sounds were different from anything she had heard so far, a complex mixture of what appeared to be multiple species moving together, punctuated by calls and sounds that suggested both great size and surprising gentleness. The swimmers in the pond seemed to recognize these approaching sounds as well, and there was a quality of anticipation in their movements as they began to arrange themselves to welcome whatever was coming next. The horses swam to positions around the pond's perimeter, creating a living border of wet, happy equines. The dolphins took up positions in the center of the pond, their sleek forms cutting through the water in slow, welcoming circles. Maya listened to the approaching sounds with growing curiosity and excitement. There seemed to be multiple types of animals in this new procession, their voices blending together in a harmony that spoke of long friendship and shared purpose. She could hear what sounded like gentle roaring, mixed with calls that reminded her of both birds and large mammals. And underneath it all, the sound of many feet moving in coordinated patterns. As the sounds grew closer, Maya realized that whatever was approaching would likely be the most spectacular addition yet to this magical gathering. The garden seemed to be building towards something, each new group of arrivals adding their own special energy to create an atmosphere of anticipation and wonder that made her feel like a child on Christmas morning. Through the willow curtain, she could see the shadows of large forms moving with purpose and grace, and she settled back into her moss cushion with a smile, ready to witness whatever new marvel was about to join this impossible congregation of joyful creatures. Chapter 6. the pride's gentle roar. The sounds that emerged from the deeper parts of the garden were unlike anything Maya had ever heard, a rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself, mixed with calls so deep and resonant that she could feel them in her chest as much as hear them with her ears. As the shadows through the willow curtain grew larger and more distinct, she realized that something truly magnificent was approaching the pond. The first creature to step into the clearing was a lioness of such noble bearing that Maya's breath caught in her throat. But this was not the fierce predator of wildlife documentaries. This lioness moved with a gentleness that seemed to radiate from her very core, her golden coat catching the bioluminescent light and throwing it back in soft, warm glows. Around her neck was woven a garland of what appeared to be flowering vines, and her eyes held an expression of such kindness that Maya felt immediately safe and welcomed. Behind the lioness came what could only be described as the most peaceful pride anyone had ever witnessed. There were lions of various ages and sizes, from massive males whose manes seemed to glow with their own inner light, to younger cats who moved with the fluid grace of dancers. But what made this procession truly extraordinary was not just their obvious gentleness. It was the fact that they were not alone. Interspersed among the lions, moving with perfect comfort and trust, were creatures that should have been running in the opposite direction. Maya saw gazelles stepping delicately alongside the great cats, their legs moving in perfect rhythm with their feline companions. Zebras walked beside lions with such casual ease that they might have been old friends meeting for a pleasant evening stroll. A family of meerkats had taken up residence on the back of one particularly patient lion, riding like tiny passengers on the world's most luxurious transportation system. As this impossible menagerie approached the pond, Maya realized that she was witnessing something that transcended every law of nature she thought she understood. This was not just interspecies cooperation. This was interspecies harmony elevated to an art form. The predators and prey moved together with such natural ease that the very concepts of predator and prey seemed to dissolve into irrelevance. The lead lioness approached the water's edge, where the swimming party was still in progress. And what happened next made Maya's heart swell with such emotion that she felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. The great cat lowered herself into the most graceful bow Maya had ever seen, a gesture of such respect and friendliness that it seemed to encompass every creature present in its warmth. The response from the assembled animals was immediate and joyous. The horses whinnied their greetings from the water. The dolphins leaped in obvious delight, and the penguins performed what appeared to be a synchronized swimming salute in honor of their new arrivals. Even the elephants raised their trunks in a gesture that clearly conveyed welcome and pleasure. But it was what happened next that truly captured Maya's imagination and filled her with wonder. The lions, rather than simply settling down to rest or observe, began to demonstrate their own unique contribution to the evening's entertainment. The lead lioness lifted her magnificent head and released a roar. But this was not the terrifying sound of a wild predator. This was music. The roar was pitched perfectly, resonating through the clearing with the rich, warm tones of the finest cello. It seemed to contain layers of sound that harmonized with themselves, creating chords that spoke directly to something primal and peaceful in Maya's soul. The other lions joined in, each adding their own voice to create a chorus that was part symphony, part lullaby, and entirely magical. The gazelles and zebras, rather than fleeing from these musical roars, began to move in response to them. Maya watched in fascination as they performed what could only be described as a dance choreographed by the lion's song. The gazelles leaped and bounded with such grace that they seemed to be interpreting the music through movement, while the zebras added their own rhythmic stepping that provided percussion to complement the lion's melodic contributions. The meerkats, from their perch atop their lion companion, began adding their own voices to the musical performance. Their high, chirping calls wove through the deeper tones of the lion's roars like the piccolo section of an orchestra, adding lightness and joy to the majestic foundation of sound. Maya found herself completely entranced by this musical menagerie. The combination of the lion's harmonic roaring, the rhythmic movement of the gazelles and zebras, and the cheerful additions from the meerkats created a symphony unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was music that seemed to reach directly into her chest and adjust her heartbeat to match its rhythm, leaving her feeling more relaxed and peaceful with each passing moment. As the musical performance continued, the other animals around the pond began to add their own contributions. The elephants provided bass notes with their deep rumbling. The horses added percussion by creating rhythmic splashing in the water. And the cows' bells chimed in perfect harmony with the overall composition. Even the dolphins contributed, their clicks and whistles weaving through the music like wind instruments played by master musicians. The penguins, not to be outdone, began a synchronized swimming routine that seemed to be choreographed specifically to match the musical performance. They moved through the water in formations that flowed and changed with the rhythm of the song, creating visual patterns that complemented the auditory feast in perfect harmony. Maya realized that she was witnessing something far more profound than entertainment. This was a form of interspecies communication that operated on levels beyond language or understanding. These creatures had found a way to share joy, to create beauty together, to transcend the boundaries that typically separated their species, and create something magical that none of them could have achieved alone. As the musical performance reached its crescendo, with every animal contributing their unique voice or movement to the collective creation, Maya felt something shift deep inside her chest. The tight knot of anxiety and stress that had been her constant companion for so long was not just loosening, it was dissolving entirely, replaced by a warm, flowing sensation that felt like being filled with liquid sunlight. The music began to wind down gradually, each voice dropping out in turn until only the lead lioness remained, her roar becoming softer and softer until it faded into the gentle evening sounds of the garden. The gazelles and zebras settled into graceful resting positions around their feline friends. The meerkats curled up in comfortable balls on their lion's back, and the entire pride arranged themselves in a peaceful circle around the pond. In the silence that followed the performance, Maya could hear her own breathing, slow and deep, and perfectly synchronized with the gentle rhythm of the garden around her. She felt more relaxed than she had in years, her body so at ease that she seemed to be melting into the moss beneath her. The stress and urgency that had driven her to seek this refuge felt like distant memories from another lifetime. As she sat in this profound state of peace, Maya became aware of new sounds approaching from the distance. These were lighter, more playful sounds, the chittering and chattering of smaller creatures, mixed with what sounded like the rustle of many small feet moving through grass and leaves. There was an energy of excitement and anticipation in these approaching sounds, as if a party of children was making its way toward the gathering. The animals around the pond seemed to recognize these sounds as well, and Maya could see expressions of delighted anticipation on their faces. Whatever was coming next would clearly add a new dimension to this magical evening, and she settled back to wait with the same eager curiosity that she could see reflected in the eyes of every creature around her. Through the growing chorus of small voices and rustling movement, Maya thought she could hear something that made her smile in anticipation. It sounded like laughter, not human laughter, but the kind of pure, joyous sounds that small creatures make when they are engaged in the most wonderful kind of mischief. Chapter 7: The Monkey Parliament's Midnight Session. The sounds of approaching mischief grew steadily louder, accompanied by what could only be described as the rustle of leaves being disturbed by many small, agile bodies moving through the trees. Maya looked up toward the canopy above the pond and caught glimpses of shadowy forms swinging from branch to branch with the fluid grace of aerial acrobats. There were occasional calls and chatters that suggested intense discussion was taking place among the approaching visitors, punctuated by sounds that could only be described as monkey laughter. The first monkey to descend from the trees did so with such theatrical flair that Maya couldn't help but applaud. A small capuchin swung down on a vine with perfect timing, released at exactly the right moment, executed a midair somersault, and landed in a perfect bow before the assembled audience. The landing was so precisely calculated, and the bow so perfectly executed, that it was clear this was a well-rehearsed performance rather than a spontaneous arrival. Behind this acrobatic ambassador came a parade of monkeys representing what appeared to be every species Maya had ever heard of, and several she was quite certain she hadn't. There were tiny spider monkeys moving through the trees like aerial dancers, their long limbs creating graceful patterns against the star-filled sky. A family of howler monkeys descended with surprising quiet, their usually boisterous voices replaced by gentle murmurs of greeting. Several langurs arrived with the dignified bearing of diplomats, while a troop of macaques brought an energy of barely contained excitement that suggested they had important business to conduct. What made this monkey parliament truly extraordinary was not just their variety, but their obvious organization. Each species seemed to have a specific role to play in the proceedings that were clearly about to unfold. The capuchin who had made the dramatic entrance appeared to be some sort of master of ceremonies, moving among the other arrivals with gestures that were clearly organizing them into specific positions around the pond. The assembled audience of larger animals watched these preparations with obvious delight and familiarity. The lions rumbled their approval. The elephants trumpet hummed in greeting, and the horses whinnied what could only be encouragement from their positions in the water. It was clear that this monkey parliament was a regular feature of the garden's evening entertainment, and one that was eagerly anticipated by all the residents. Maya noticed that the monkeys were carrying things with them, not tools or food, but objects that seemed to have ceremonial significance. Some carried what appeared to be small, intricately woven garlands made from vines and flowers. Others held polished stones that caught the bioluminescent light and threw it back in sparkles. A few of the larger monkeys carried what looked like staffs made from specially selected branches, carved with patterns that suggested both artistry and meaning. The capuchin master of ceremonies climbed onto a prominent rock that jutted out into the pond, raised one tiny hand for attention, and began what was clearly an important announcement. His speech was delivered in a rapid-fire series of chatters and calls that somehow managed to convey both formality and tremendous excitement. Though Maya couldn't understand the words, the gestures and intonation made it clear that something significant was about to take place. As the announcement concluded, the monkey parliament arranged itself in what appeared to be a highly organized seating chart around the pond. The smaller monkeys clustered in the lower branches of the surrounding trees, creating a natural gallery of observers. The medium-sized species positioned themselves on rocks and fallen logs around the water's edge, while the largest monkeys took seats that appeared to be reserved for beings of particular importance or seniority. What followed was unlike any legislative session Maya had ever witnessed or imagined. The parliament began with what appeared to be a reading of minutes from their previous meeting, delivered by a very serious-looking langur who consulted what seemed to be marks scratched onto a piece of bark. The reading was punctuated by various responses from the assembly, sounds of agreement, occasional objections that prompted brief debates, and moments of what could only be described as parliamentary laughter. The business of the session appeared to involve a series of presentations by different species, each demonstrating some form of skill or discovery for the approval and enjoyment of their colleagues. Maya watched, fascinated, as a spider monkey performed what could only be described as an aerial thesis defense, swinging through the trees in patterns so complex and beautiful that they seemed to illustrate advanced concepts in three-dimensional geometry. The howler monkeys, despite their reputation for volume, delivered what appeared to be a paper on acoustics, demonstrating how different calls could be modulated to carry specific meanings over various distances. Their presentation was so sophisticated that the elephant matriarch nodded her approval several times, clearly recognizing expertise when she heard it. But it was the macaques who provided the evening's most entertaining academic presentation. They had apparently been conducting research into the optimal techniques for what could only be described as professional-grade belly flopping. What followed was a series of demonstrations that would have made Olympic diving judges weep, not with admiration for technical perfection, but with laughter at the creative ways one could enter water while maximizing both splash and comedy value. Each macaque approached their demonstration with the seriousness of a doctoral candidate defending their thesis. They would position themselves carefully, make a brief announcement about the specific technique they were about to demonstrate, then execute their belly flop with such commitment and enthusiasm that the resulting splash was merely a bonus to the sheer joy of their performance. Maya found herself laughing so hard that she had to wipe tears from her eyes. The sight of these earnest researchers presenting their findings on optimal splash techniques, while their distinguished colleagues took careful mental notes and occasionally tried to replicate particularly impressive results, was so wonderfully absurd that it seemed to capture everything magical about this impossible place. The presentations continued with each species contributing their own area of expertise. A group of capuchins demonstrated advanced techniques in cooperative problem solving, working together to build elaborate structures from vines and branches that seemed to serve no purpose other than the joy of creation. Several spider monkeys presented their research into optimal swinging trajectories, their mathematical precision evident in the perfect arcs they traced through the air. As each presentation concluded, the Parliament would engage in what appeared to be rigorous peer review, with questions and comments flying back and forth in a complex mixture of chatters, calls, and gestures. The discussions were clearly heated at times, but always maintained an air of collegial respect that would have impressed any human academic institution. Maya realized that she was witnessing something profound here, not just entertainment, but a form of knowledge sharing and community building that transcended species boundaries. These creatures had created their own form of intellectual discourse, their own way of celebrating discovery and innovation, their own academic tradition that honored both serious inquiry and joyful play. The parliamentary session reached its climax with what appeared to be a group project that involved every monkey present. They began working together to create something in the center of the pond, a floating sculpture made from vines, flowers, and carefully selected stones that seemed to grow more complex and beautiful with each edition. As Maya watched this collaborative artwork take shape, she felt a profound sense of peace settling over her like the softest blanket. The Monkey Parliament's session had been intellectually engaging, genuinely funny, and somehow deeply meaningful all at once. She found herself thinking about her own life, her own work, and wondering if she had lost sight of the joy that could come from learning and creating and sharing knowledge with others. The floating sculpture was nearing completion now, and Maya could see that it was going to be something truly special, a work of art that represented not just the creativity of its makers, but their ability to work together toward a common goal, despite their differences. The sight of dozens of different monkey species collaborating so seamlessly filled her with hope about what might be possible when beings chose cooperation over competition. As the last touches were added to the sculpture, Maya became aware of new sounds approaching from the distance. These were different from anything she had heard so far tonight. A complex mixture of what sounded like many different bird calls, mixed with the rustle of feathers, and what could only be described as aerial acrobatics taking place somewhere above the trees. The monkey parliament seemed to recognize these approaching sounds as the perfect conclusion to their session. They began to settle into comfortable positions around the pond, their parliamentary business complete, and their floating artwork serving as a centerpiece for whatever aerial display was about to grace their gathering. Maya looked up toward the sky with growing anticipation, wondering what new wonder was about to join this magical congregation of creatures who had somehow found a way to turn evening entertainment into something approaching the sacred. Chapter 8: The Avian Aerial Academy. The sky above the garden began to fill with shadows that moved with such grace and precision that Maya initially thought she might be watching clouds rearranging themselves in the evening breeze. But as the shadows grew closer and more distinct, she realized that what was approaching was far more extraordinary than any meteorological phenomenon. The air itself seemed to be alive with wings, hundreds, perhaps thousands of wings, all moving in patterns that suggested both perfect coordination and joyful spontaneity. The first birds to descend from the darkening sky were a squadron of pelicans flying in formation, so precise it would have impressed military pilots. But there was nothing martial about their approach. These were pelicans who had clearly studied the art of synchronized flying and elevated it to something approaching performance art. They moved through the air in patterns that drew loops and spirals against the star-filled sky, their massive wingspans creating graceful arcs that seemed to paint invisible masterpieces in the evening air. Behind the pelican formation came wave after wave of other species, each group bringing their own unique contribution to what was clearly going to be the most spectacular air show Maya had ever witnessed. A murmuration of starlings flowed through the sky like liquid mercury, their movements so fluid and coordinated that they seemed to be a single organism rather than thousands of individual birds. Flamingos added splashes of pink that caught the garden's bioluminescent glow and reflected it back in shades of rose and coral. But it was when the peacocks arrived that Maya truly understood the magnitude of what she was witnessing. These magnificent birds didn't simply fly. They soared with their tail feathers fully displayed, creating moving rainbows against the night sky that were so beautiful they seemed to make the stars themselves pale in comparison. The sight of peacocks in full display executing aerial maneuvers was so breathtaking that Maya felt her heart might stop from the sheer beauty of it. The assembled audience around the pond watched this aerial display with obvious awe and appreciation. The monkeys in the trees chattered their approval. The elephants raised their trunks in salute, and the lions added their harmonic roars to create a soundtrack that perfectly complemented the visual feast above. Even the swimming horses had stopped their aquatic activities to crane their necks upward, clearly not wanting to miss a moment of the show. As Maya watched, completely transfixed, the aerial performance began to organize itself into what could only be described as a three-dimensional ballet. Different species took turns demonstrating their unique flying abilities, while the others provided a supporting chorus of movement around them. The starlings would flow into complex formations, while the pelicans created a framework of steady, graceful circles around them. The flamingos added accents of color that punctuated the starlings' patterns, while the peacocks provided moments of such spectacular beauty that they seemed to pause time itself. But the true magic began when the birds started to interact with the earthbound audience below. The pelicans, with their large bills and gentle nature, began a game of aerial catch with the monkeys, who threw specially selected fruits up into the air for the birds to catch, and then drop into the mouths of waiting companions below. The precision required for this interspecies collaboration was extraordinary, but the birds and monkeys made it look effortless. The starlings created what could only be described as living sculptures in the air above the pond, formations that spelled out recognizable shapes, and then dissolved into new patterns before Maya could fully process what she had seen. She was sure she saw a perfect heart formed by thousands of tiny birds, followed by what appeared to be a flower that bloomed, and then scattered into seeds that became new formations entirely. The flamingos, working in smaller groups, performed aerial dances that seemed to be telling stories. Maya watched a group of 12 flamingos execute a narrative that appeared to involve romance, comedy, and a happy ending that left all the participants in graceful spirals of obvious satisfaction. Their long necks and legs created lines against the sky that were so elegant they seemed to have been drawn by the finest calligrapher. Meanwhile, the peacocks provided moments of pure visual poetry. They would position themselves at strategic points in the sky, and then open their magnificent tail feathers all at once, creating bursts of color and pattern that were like fireworks made of living jewels. The effect was so stunning that each display prompted spontaneous applause from the entire audience below. Maya found herself entering an even deeper state of relaxation as she watched this aerial ballet. There was something about the flowing movements of the birds, the way they seemed to dance with the air itself, that created a hypnotic effect that reached directly into her nervous system and encouraged every muscle to release its tension. She felt as if she was floating along with the performers, her consciousness somehow lifted above the everyday concerns that had weighed her down for so long. The Aerial Academy reached new heights of creativity when the different species began to combine their abilities into collaborative performances. Maya watched in wonder as starlings formed the framework for elaborate patterns that pelicans then filled in with their larger, more deliberate movements. Flamingos added lines of color that connected different parts of the formation, while peacocks provided spectacular punctuation marks that transformed the entire composition into moving art. One particular collaboration took Maya's breath away completely. The starlings arranged themselves into what appeared to be a vast, three-dimensional flower, their dark bodies creating the structure of petals and stem. The flamingos then flew through this formation, their pink bodies becoming the flower's color and bringing it to life. Finally, the peacocks positioned themselves at the center of the formation and opened their tail feathers simultaneously, creating the most spectacular flower center imaginable, a burst of iridescent color that made the entire sky seem to bloom. As this aerial masterpiece dissolved and reformed into new patterns, Maya became aware that her breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the bird's movements. Each formation seemed to correspond with one of her inhales, each dissolution with an exhale, as if the entire performance was designed to guide her into the deepest possible state of relaxation and peace. The performance continued with each species taking turns to showcase their individual specialties. The pelicans demonstrated formation, flying so precise it could have been choreographed by mathematicians. Their ability to maintain perfect spacing and timing while executing complex maneuvers was so impressive that it spoke of intelligence and cooperation that transcended anything Maya had thought possible in the animal kingdom. The starlings showed off their mastery of collective intelligence, forming patterns that seemed to emerge from the group mind rather than from any individual decision-making. Maya watched thousands of birds move as if controlled by a single consciousness, creating formations so complex and beautiful that they seemed to reveal secret patterns hidden in the very structure of nature itself. The flamingos proved that grace and beauty could be maintained even while performing the most athletic aerial maneuvers. They executed synchronized dives and climbs that would have challenged the most skilled human pilots. But they did so with such elegance that their movements looked more like dance than aviation. And the peacocks created moments of such pure beauty that Maya felt tears of joy gathering in her eyes. Each time they spread their magnificent plumage against the star-filled sky. It was as if the universe itself was showing off, displaying its capacity for creating beauty so profound that it touched something sacred in everyone who witnessed it. As the Aerial Academy's performance began to wind down, the birds arranged themselves in a final formation that encompassed the entire sky above the pond. It was a mandala of living creatures, a pattern so perfect and harmonious that it seemed to represent the very essence of peace and cooperation. Maya lay back on her moss cushion, looking up at this living artwork, and felt something shift in her consciousness. She was no longer just an observer of this magical place. She was part of it. The stress and anxiety that had driven her here were not just absent. They had been transformed into something else entirely. In their place was a sense of connection to something larger than herself, a feeling of being held and supported by the same force that allowed thousands of birds to move in perfect harmony. As the birds began to settle into the trees around the pond, their days flying done, Maya became aware of new sounds emerging from the deeper parts of the garden. These sounds were different from anything she had heard so far, gentle, mysterious, and somehow ancient. They spoke of wisdom and patience and creatures who had mastered the art of finding joy in the simplest pleasures. Maya smiled as she recognized what was approaching. The final act of this magical evening was about to begin, and she knew with absolute certainty that it would be exactly what her soul needed to complete its journey toward perfect peace. Chapter 9: The Great Migration to Dreamland. As the last of the aerial performers settled into their roosts among the trees, a profound quiet descended over the garden that felt different from the silences that had punctuated the evening's entertainment. This was not the expectant hush that preceded a new performance, but something deeper, a stillness that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the earth itself. Maya found herself breathing more slowly without conscious effort, as if the air itself had grown thicker with peace and contentment. From the deepest parts of the garden came sounds that were almost too gentle to hear at first. A soft rustling that spoke of large forms moving with infinite care and deliberation. There was a quality to these approaching sounds that suggested great age and wisdom. Creatures who had learned that the most profound journeys were taken at the pace of growing grass and flowing water. The first creature to emerge from the darkness was a giant tortoise whose shell seemed to glow with its own inner light. But this was not the solitary, plodding movement that Maya might have expected. This ancient being moved with purpose and dignity, carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had important work to do and unlimited time in which to do it perfectly. Behind her came a procession that defied every expectation Maya had developed about the evening's entertainment. There were more tortoises, each unique in size and markings, but all moving with that same quality of timeless patience. Interspersed among them were sloths, hanging from carefully constructed portable branches that they carried with them like the world's most relaxed parade floats. Their movements were so slow and deliberate that watching them seemed to actually slow time itself. But what made this procession truly extraordinary was what the tortoises were carrying. Upon each, ancient shell rode passengers who had clearly been selected for their perfect compatibility with this leisurely pace of travel. Maya saw koalas nestled comfortably on tortoise shells, their eucalyptus-scented drowsiness adding to the atmosphere of perfect relaxation that surrounded the approaching group. Pandas rode other shells, some sleeping peacefully, others munching bamboo with the kind of methodical contentment that spoke of creatures who had mastered the art of finding joy in life's simplest pleasures. The lead tortoise approached the pond's edge, where all the evening's performers had gathered to witness this final act. And Maya realized that what she was seeing was not just another entertainment, but a ceremony. This was the great migration to Dreamland, the gentle transition from the day's activities to the restorative peace of sleep. And every creature in the garden was invited to participate. The wise old tortoise positioned herself at what appeared to be a designated spot near the water's edge and began to speak. Her voice was like the sound of ancient stones settling into their foundations, deep, resonant, and filled with the kind of authority that comes from having witnessed centuries of sunrises and sunsets. Though Maya couldn't understand her words, the meaning was clear in the tone and cadence. This was a bedtime story, told in the language of creatures who understood that the transition to sleep was itself a sacred journey. As the tortoise's story unfolded, the other animals around the pond began to settle into their sleeping positions. The lions arranged themselves in a comfortable pile, their earlier musical performance having tired them in the most satisfying way. The elephants formed a protective circle, their massive bulk creating a natural windbreak for the smaller creatures. The horses waded slowly out of the pond, water streaming from their coats as they found soft spots on the grass where they could rest their tired muscles. The pandas on the tortoise shells seemed to be falling asleep even as they listened to the story, their gentle snoring adding a percussion section to the tortoise's narrative. The koalas were already dreaming, their soft gray bodies completely relaxed in positions that would have been uncomfortable for any creature less adapted to the art of sleeping. Maya found herself being drawn into the story despite not understanding the words. There was something in the rhythm of the tortoise's voice that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and speak directly to the parts of her brain responsible for rest and restoration. She felt her eyelids growing heavy, not with the forced drowsiness of someone trying to fall asleep, but with the natural, inevitable tiredness that comes at the end of a perfectly satisfying day. The sloths had suspended themselves from their portable branches in positions around the pond, creating a canopy of slowly moving fur that caught and filtered the gentle light from the bioluminescent flowers. Their presence seemed to slow everything down even further, as if their legendary lethargy was contagious in the most wonderful way. Maya could feel her own metabolism slowing to match theirs, her heartbeat finding a rhythm that seemed more appropriate for hibernation than for her normal, hectic existence. As the tortoise's story continued, other creatures began to add their own gentle contributions to the bedtime narrative. A panda would occasionally mumble something in its sleep that seemed to fit perfectly into the flow of the tale. A sloth would make a soft, contented sound that added emotional punctuation to particularly meaningful passages. Even the dolphins contributed, their breathing creating gentle bubbles that rose to the surface of the pond in patterns that seemed to illustrate whatever scene was being described. Maya realized that the story being told was not just entertainment for its audience. It was a collective creation, a bedtime story that belonged to all the creatures of the garden and was being told by all of them together. Each animal's presence, each gentle sound, each peaceful movement was part of the narrative, creating a lullaby that was sung not just with voices, but with entire beings dedicated to the art of perfect relaxation. The monkeys in the trees had settled into quiet clusters, their earlier parliamentary energy transformed into the drowsy contentment of children who had played hard and were ready for rest. Their occasional soft chatters seemed to be private conversations about the day's events, the kind of gentle processing that helps a mind transition from activity to sleep. The birds in their roosts were creating their own soft symphony of settling sounds, the rustle of feathers being arranged for maximum comfort, the gentle cooing of doves saying good night to their neighbors, the barely audible whisper of wings folding into perfect sleeping positions. Maya could hear, somewhere in the distance, what sounded like an owl family having a quiet discussion about the best spots for the evening's hunting. But even these sounds of activity were so gentle and peaceful that they seemed to contribute to the overall atmosphere of approaching sleep rather than disturbing it. The tortoise's story was reaching what appeared to be its conclusion, her ancient voice growing softer and slower as she approached the ending that would signal to the entire garden that it was time for sleep. Maya could feel the anticipation of rest settling over every creature present, like the softest blanket. A collective readiness for the restorative journey that sleep would bring. But even as the formal storytelling was ending, Maya became aware that the real magic was just beginning. The tortoises, their passengers, and the sloths were beginning to arrange themselves in a pattern around the pond that seemed to be designed for optimal sleep for everyone present. This was not just a random settling down for the night. This was a carefully orchestrated transition to a state of rest so profound that it seemed to reach beyond ordinary sleep into something approaching the sacred. The lead tortoise finished her story with a sound that was part sigh, part blessing, and entirely filled with the promise of peaceful dreams. As her voice faded into the gentle night sounds of the garden, Maya felt herself being drawn into a state of relaxation, so complete that she couldn't tell where her own consciousness ended and the collective peace of the garden began. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it, not just rest from her troubles, but a way of being that incorporated rest into its very essence. These creatures had shown her that peace was not something to be achieved through effort, but something to be received through the simple act of allowing herself to be part of something larger and more gentle than her individual struggles. As the garden settled into its nighttime rhythm, Maya felt herself becoming part of that rhythm, her breathing synchronizing with the collective breath of dozens of peacefully sleeping creatures. The stress and anxiety that had driven her to seek this refuge felt like distant memories from another lifetime, replaced by a sense of belonging and security that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The transition to sleep was so gradual and gentle that Maya couldn't identify the exact moment when observation became participation, when watching became being. She was aware of becoming part of the garden's dream, part of a collective vision of peace that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of the physical space and into realms of pure contentment and joy. As consciousness gently released its hold, Maya's last coherent thought was a profound sense of gratitude for the garden, for its magical inhabitants, and for the reminder that peace was always available to those who knew how to receive it. The garden's greatest gift was not just showing her how to rest, but showing her that rest was her natural state, the foundation from which all true joy emerged. Chapter 10: The Deep Waters of Restoration. In the space between sleeping and waking, Maya found herself floating in a realm that was neither fully dream nor entirely waking consciousness. She was aware of being supported by something infinitely soft and warm, as if the moss-covered boulder had transformed into a cloud made of pure comfort. Around her, the sounds of the garden continued, the gentle breathing of sleeping animals, the soft whisper of night breezes through leaves, the distant murmur of water over stone. But these sounds seemed to be coming from both outside and inside her, as if she had become part of the garden's very metabolism. The bioluminescent flowers that had provided gentle lighting throughout the evening's entertainments now pulsed with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, creating waves of soft blue and green light that seemed to flow through her body as much as around it. Each pulse brought with it a deeper release of tension, as if the light itself was a healing force that reached into every cell and reminded it of its capacity for peace. Maya became aware that she was not alone in this liminal space. Around her, floating in the same gentle suspension between sleep and waking, were the consciousness of the garden's other inhabitants. She could sense the dreams of the lions, filled with harmonious roars that painted rainbows across imaginary skies. The elephants' minds held visions of endless, peaceful grasslands where every step brought deeper wisdom. The horses galloped through underwater kingdoms where swimming was as natural as breathing. The dolphins' dreams were liquid symphonies of sound and movement, while the penguins experienced visions of perfect diplomatic ceremonies where every speech was understood by every listener. The monkeys dreamed of collaborative discoveries that solved the universe's greatest mysteries through play. And the birds soared through dimensions where every flight path created new constellations in previously empty skies. All of these dream experiences seemed to be flowing together into a collective vision of perfect harmony. And Maya found herself able to participate in each one, experiencing the joy of flight without leaving the ground, feeling the satisfaction of perfect teamwork without losing her individual identity, knowing the peace of deep wisdom without having to work to achieve it. But deeper than all of these individual dreams was something else, a presence that seemed to be the source of the garden itself. It was ancient beyond measure, patient beyond understanding, and filled with a love so profound that it seemed to be the very substance from which peace was made. This presence didn't communicate through words or images, but through direct transmission of feeling. And what it transmitted was simple and transformative. You are safe. You are loved. You belong here. Rest is your birthright. Maya felt these truths settling into her bones, like nutrients being absorbed by a plant that had been thirsting for water. The tight, defended places in her mind that had been holding themselves rigid against the possibility of danger began to soften and open. The voice in her head that had been constantly cataloging threats and planning defensive strategies grew quiet, replaced by a deep knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. As this profound relaxation deepened, Maya began to experience something that felt like memories, but not of her own life. She was remembering how it felt to be perfectly at peace in the world, how it felt to live without the constant background hum of anxiety that had become so familiar she had stopped noticing it. She was remembering her own capacity for joy, for play, for the kind of open-hearted engagement with life that she had witnessed in all the garden's inhabitants. The tortoise's ancient wisdom seemed to flow through her consciousness, carrying with it the understanding that all of life's urgency was illusion, that the truly important things happened at the pace of growing trees and forming mountains. The sloth's patient contentment showed her that efficiency was not the highest value, that there was profound worth in simply being present to each moment as it unfolded. From the pandas came the knowledge that simplicity was not limitation, but liberation, that finding deep satisfaction in basic pleasures was a form of enlightenment that most humans spent lifetimes seeking. The koalas transmitted the wisdom of perfect rest, the understanding that sleep was not escape from life, but full participation in life's restorative cycles. As these gifts of understanding integrated into her being, Maya felt fundamental changes taking place in her nervous system. Patterns of tension that had been locked in place for years were dissolving, replaced by new patterns based on trust rather than vigilance, on cooperation rather than competition, on being rather than doing. The healing went deeper than she had thought possible. It reached into her childhood, into the places where she had first learned that the world was not entirely safe, and gently corrected those early misunderstandings. It reached into her relationships, showing her how to love and be loved without the protective barriers that had kept her isolated in her fear. It reached into her work, revealing how productivity could arise from peace rather than pressure, how creativity flowed most freely from a mind at rest. Maya realized that what she was experiencing was not just a temporary respite from stress, but a fundamental rewiring of her entire approach to being alive. The garden was not just showing her how to relax, it was teaching her how to live from a place of inherent peace, rather than desperately trying to achieve peace through external accomplishment. As this transformation deepened, Maya became aware of something remarkable happening around her. The other dreamers in the garden were sharing their own healing processes, creating a collective field of restoration that amplified the healing available to each individual. The lion's courage was healing the places where she had been afraid to be powerful. The elephant's wisdom was healing the places where she had forgotten her own deep knowing. The horse's playfulness was healing the places where she had forgotten how to enjoy her own strength. Each creature's gift of wholeness was becoming part of her own wholeness. And simultaneously, her own healing was contributing to the collective restoration happening in the garden. She understood that this was how healing really worked, not in isolation, but in community, not through individual effort, but through collective support, not by fixing what was broken, but by remembering what had always been whole. The night sky above the garden seemed to be participating in this healing process as well. The stars were not just distant lights, but conscious presences, each one beaming down specific frequencies of peace and restoration. The moon was a gentle mother, wrapping the entire garden in silver light that carried with it the promise of cycles, that all things passed, that rest always followed activity, that dawn always came after the deepest darkness. Maya felt herself being cradled by the entire universe, held in a field of love so vast and complete that her individual worries and struggles seemed like ripples on an infinite ocean. She was not being asked to solve anything or achieve anything or become anything other than what she already was. She was simply being invited to remember her own perfection, her own inherent worth, her own natural capacity for peace. As the night deepened and the healing continued, Maya became aware that something was being offered to her, a choice about how she would carry this experience back into her regular life. She could treat it as a pleasant dream, a temporary escape that would fade with the morning light. Or she could accept it as a genuine transformation, a new way of being that would travel with her wherever she went. The choice required no effort to make. Every cell in her body was saying yes to this new way of being, yes to carrying this peace into the world, yes to becoming a living reminder that rest and joy and gentle cooperation were always possible, no matter what external circumstances might suggest. As she made this choice, Maya felt something like wings unfolding inside her chest. Not physical wings, but something far more practical. The capacity to fly above the turbulence of daily life while remaining fully engaged with it. The ability to maintain her connection to this deep peace, even in the midst of whatever challenges might arise. The garden had given her the ultimate gift, not escape from her life, but a new way of living it. Epilogue, the gentle return. Maya opened her eyes to find herself lying on the moss-covered boulder beside the pond, surrounded by the soft sounds of creatures beginning to stir with the approaching dawn. But the awakening felt different from any she had ever experienced. Gentle, natural, without the jarring transition from sleep to alertness that usually marked the beginning of her days. Instead, she felt like she was surfacing slowly from the deepest, most restorative waters imaginable. The garden around her was bathed in the pearl gray light of early morning, and the bioluminescent flowers were gradually dimming as the natural light increased. But rather than feeling like magic was leaving the place, Maya sensed that the magic was simply changing forms, becoming more subtle, but no less present. The extraordinary was revealing itself to be the perfectly ordinary miracle of a new day beginning. Around the pond, the various creatures were engaging in their own versions of morning routines. But even these everyday activities retained the gentle, playful quality that had characterized the previous evening's entertainments. The elephants were performing what appeared to be morning yoga. Their stretches and breathing exercises creating a peaceful rhythm that set the tone for the entire garden. The horses had returned to the water for what seemed to be a morning swim, but their movements were relaxed and leisurely rather than energetic. The lions were grooming each other with obvious affection, their earlier musical abilities now expressing themselves in contented purring that harmonized beautifully with the morning bird songs. The monkeys were engaged in what appeared to be a breakfast meeting, their discussions punctuated by the same collegial laughter that had characterized their parliamentary session. Maya sat up slowly, amazed to discover that her body felt completely different than it had when she first arrived at the garden. Every muscle was relaxed, every joint moved freely, and there was an overall sense of lightness that made her feel as if she was made of something more buoyant than regular flesh and bone. The chronic tension that had lived between her shoulder blades for years was completely gone, replaced by a feeling of openness and strength that seemed to emanate from her very core. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the transformation in her mental and emotional state. The constant background chatter of anxiety that had been her almost constant companion was nowhere to be found. In its place was a quiet confidence, a deep knowing that she was fundamentally safe in the world and inherently capable of handling whatever might arise. The lead tortoise, who had told the bedtime story the night before, approached Maya's resting place with the same dignified pace that had characterized all her movements. As she drew near, Maya felt a wave of recognition pass between them, not the recognition of having met before, but the deeper recognition of kindred spirits who understood something essential about the nature of peace. The ancient reptile positioned herself where Maya could look directly into her wise, patient eyes. And in that gaze, Maya saw a reflection of her own transformed state. She was no longer the anxious, driven person who had stumbled into the garden seeking escape. She had become someone who carried peace as her natural state, someone who could offer to the world the same kind of gentle presence that the garden's inhabitants had offered to her. Without words, the tortoise conveyed a message that went straight to Maya's heart. This peace you have found is not something that belongs only to this place. It is your natural inheritance, available to you always. Take it with you. Share it freely. Remember that wherever you go, you carry within you the capacity to create gardens of peace for others who are seeking what you were seeking. Maya reached out slowly and gently touched the tortoise's ancient shell. Feeling through that contact a final transmission of wisdom, she understood that her time in the garden had been both a healing and a preparation, a restoration of her own natural capacity for peace, and a reminder of her ability to help others find that same capacity within themselves. As she sat in the growing morning light, surrounded by creatures who had shown her that joy was the natural state of beings who lived in harmony with themselves and each other, Maya felt a profound gratitude that seemed to fill her entire being. This gratitude was not just for the healing she had received, but for the reminder of what was possible when beings chose cooperation over competition, playfulness over productivity, and presence over performance. The garden had shown her that peace was not something she needed to achieve through effort, but something she could access through the simple act of remembering her own inherent wholeness. The animals had demonstrated that joy was not a reward for good behavior, but the natural expression of beings who had not forgotten their connection to the fundamental friendliness of existence. Maya stood slowly, feeling her body move with a grace and ease that seemed to reflect her internal transformation. She looked around the garden one last time, knowing that she would carry its essence with her wherever she went. The stress and urgency that had driven her to seek this refuge now seemed like echoes from another lifetime, replaced by a quiet confidence in her ability to navigate life from a place of inherent peace. As she began to walk toward the path that would lead her back to her regular life, Maya heard behind her a gentle chorus of farewell sounds, the soft trumpeting of elephants, the musical calls of dolphins, the harmonious roaring of lions, and the dignified farewells of the penguin delegation. But these were not sad goodbyes. They were expressions of joy from creatures who knew that what had been shared could never be lost, that the connections formed in the garden would continue to nourish and support her wherever her journey led. The path back into the world felt different beneath her feet than it had when she first discovered the garden. Then, she had been walking away from something unbearable. Now, she was walking towards something magnificent, a life lived from the foundation of peace she had rediscovered, a way of being that would allow her to offer to others the same gift of gentle presence that had been offered to her. As Maya walked, she carried with her the memory of dolphins playing with pufferfish, of penguins conducting diplomatic ceremonies, of cows performing ballet, of elephants practicing yoga, of horses discovering the joys of synchronized swimming, of lions creating harmony through song, of monkeys building knowledge through play, of birds painting masterpieces across the sky, and of tortoises and sloths, showing that the deepest wisdom often moved at the pace of growing grass. But more than memories, she carried with her the living reality of what she had become through her encounter with these gentle teachers. She was no longer someone seeking peace. She was someone who embodied peace. She was no longer someone who needed to be healed. She was someone who could participate in the healing of others simply by being authentically herself. The garden had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the reminder that peace was her birthright, that joy was her natural state, and that the capacity to create harmony in the world was not something she needed to develop, but something she needed to remember she had always possessed. As the path curved ahead of her, leading back toward the life she had temporarily left behind, Maya smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that she would never again be without access to the garden of peace that lived within her own heart. The external world might present its challenges, but she now carried within herself an unshakable foundation of calm from which to meet whatever arose. The garden lived on in her transformed nervous system, in her capacity for joy, in her ability to see the inherent goodness in all beings, and in her remembrance that peace was not a destination to be reached, but a way of traveling through whatever landscape life might present. Maya walked toward her new life, carrying the essence of the garden with her, the knowledge that every moment offered the opportunity to choose peace over anxiety, cooperation over competition, presence over performance, and love over fear. She had become a bridge between the magical realm she was leaving and the ordinary world she was returning to, carrying the profound truth that there was no real difference between them. In her heart, she held the gentle laughter of creatures who had never forgotten how to play. And in her bones, she carried the deep rest of beings who knew that their worth was not dependent on their productivity. These gifts were no longer just memories of a magical night. They had become the very foundation of who she was. As Maya walked back into the world, she did so as a living reminder that peace was always possible, that joy was always accessible, and that the deepest healing often came through the simple act of remembering that we are all, at our core, exactly as perfect as the garden's gentle creatures had always known themselves to be. The garden of gentle laughter lived on in every step she took, every breath she breathed, and every moment of peace she would offer to a world that desperately needed reminding of its own inherent capacity for harmony, joy, and the kind of deep rest that heals everything it touches. And in her wake, as she walked toward her transformed life, the garden settled back into its timeless rhythm of growth and rest, play and peace, ready to welcome the next weary wanderer who stumbled upon its magical boundaries in search of the very healing that was their birthright, waiting to be remembered.